this episode, we're covering the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. Now, after the election, when Labour gained over 200 seats and the Conservatives lost more than 250, I think we all thought that the Labour Party conference would have a bit of a party, celebratory vibe, and the Tories would basically be a funeral. But having come back from Birmingham, that really wasn't the case at all. Helping us understand the denial, anger and bargaining phases of this long drawn-out grief process, we have the New Statesman's political editor, Andrew Marr, and senior editor, George Eaton, with me in the studio. Welcome, both of you. George, you were with me in Birmingham. Andrew, you were watching it all from London.
I represent the large swathe of the political and media community who decided this year, for the first time in my case, I think ever, not to go to the Conservative Party conference. Two reasons. One, there was no sort of central office operation offering up people for interview, so you didn't know who you were going to get. Was it worth the money? But also I felt they're talking to each other, not to the rest of the country.
I think there very much was a sense of it's all up for grabs, no sort of central, no real CCHQ presence at all. George, you were there though. You, like me, I think found it slightly strange arriving and finding out that they actually weren't nearly as depressed as we all thought they were going to be.
Yes, I mean, I think there's several reasons. There's sort of liberation from the burdens of office. They're having a leadership contest. As Andrew says, it's an excuse to talk about themselves, not the country. They're certainly doing a lot of that. They're all in different ways pitching to the right of the party. But they've also been heartened by the fall in Keir Starmer's approval ratings and the government in general, and think they can bounce back after one term. After all, Labour suffered big landslide defeat in 2019, came back in a single term. So they think, why can't we do it? And there I think they could be making a big mistake, which is that failures, difficulties for Labour don't equate necessarily to success for the opposition. If you want a lesson in that, just look at the past 14 years.
The main takeaway for me, and I mean this takeaway literally, was that all of the candidates had little merchandise stalls with various branded stash. James Cleverly had fans. I'm a Cleverly fan, get it. There were lots of hats. Robert Jenrick had some umbrellas. Kemi Badenoch had apples with her name on them. But I think the prize for the stash definitely goes to Tom Tugendhat. George, I got you a present, as
Thank
well
you.
as the fake tan. There was this. Do you want to explain what that is?
It's a Tom Tugendhat. There it is. The benefit. Who says you don't get anything from Conservative conferences?
A Tom Tugendhat, yes. A temporary tattoo of Tom's name in a little heart. Where on your body are you going to put that?
Let's go here. Let's have it sort of on
While you're doing that, Andrew, taking a sort of zoomed out view from London, did you get the sense that it was all a bit delusional as well, or did you feel that there was something actually in this idea that Labour's poll ratings are falling quite dramatically and therefore maybe they don't have to be as depressed as they have been?
I think I'm sorry, I'm just looking at you. I'm really, really disappointed you're not wearing a Tom Tugendhat.
I asked for one.
I
genuinely asked for one, and they said that those were not for journalists, but I managed to get the tattoo.
Very good for you. So, no, I think that, clearly the government has had an absolutely miserable few weeks. As George says, poll ratings plummeting, the freebie scandals, all sorts of internal tensions, the backwash of the winter fuel payments that we've talked about, the cut there. I think they've just had a miserable time, and the Tories look over. And they've had so long of being told by everybody, including us, how useless and awful they were in government. And they look across the aisle and they think, actually, that lot could be even worse. And I think that is generating a lot of bonhomie and goodwill inside the Conservatives towards each other. But I agree with George. I think it's likely to be delusional. I was speaking to somebody who was absolutely at the core of the Blair operation after 1997, reminding me what a terrible time they had in their first few weeks. They didn't know what they were doing. There were lots of fights with the civil service, lots of confusion, and ultimately the Bernie Ecclestone scandal. And this is not dissimilar. And then, of course, they then went on to romp home 5 years later for another big election of victory. So I think it's very, very early to declare that this is all over.
I think the other thing that was keeping the mood quite cheerful was that there was a purpose to this conference, which was the beauty pageant of Conservative leadership contenders who all got multiple opportunities to be interviewed, do hustings, and then make their speeches. Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat. I spoke to Robert Colville, the director of the Centre for Policy Studies, who interviewed three of the candidates about what he made of the race so far.
They all have strengths and weaknesses in very different ways. I mean, James Cleverly is just very, very good at being human. Like, he is the kind of guy you would want to have a drink in a pub with. Rob Jenrick, he's very, very good at being a politician. And I don't mean that in a kind of bad way. He has, though, the polished, perfect answer to every question.
He talked more about policy, and James Cleverly talked more about vibes and tone.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. But also, I think with Jenrick, he is generally accepted now as being the front runner among MPs. He's kind of a lock for the final two. So he can do that thing of spreading his gaze a bit more and say, look, I'm not just about immigration, I also care about these other areas. I want to start widening my appeal. Whereas the others are still in that like sort of death struggle to become the person who opposes him. But I think Cleverly, in his case, his narrative to people, and Tugendhat's to an extent, but it's especially Cleverly, is that he is the most electorally appealing. He's the best on TV. He has done Question Time more than all of the others put together. He did a sort of 10-second speech where he basically said, look, if you want to dick about, pick one of the others. If you want to win, pick me. So he's betting that this is 2005, he is David Cameron, and the party is going to prioritise the person who puts the biggest bump on their poll ratings.
Andrew, what do you make of that and the performance of all four of the candidates over those 4 days?
Well, I really agree with what we've just heard. I think that Cleverly is far and away the most impressive of the candidates. He's done the big jobs. He's had to defend Boris Johnson in the toughest days. You know, he's liked right across the party. If they're choosing somebody who can be Prime Minister relatively soon, they should be choosing him. I have to say, you know, the endorsement of the New Statesman might well be the kiss of death. I mean, the other candidate we have to talk about, I think, is Kemi Badenoch, because looking at the speeches and listening to all the interviews, it seemed to me, you know, the vibe, to use that horrible word, for the rest of them was a kind of dad rock garage band atmosphere. And she's the standout punk figure. She's the one who has got that edge of sort of danger that you go to, you know, a stand-up comedian for, and you're thinking, they're not going to say that. They're not going to say, oh, they just have said that. Oh, my God. And she's a bit like that. There's the sense that you never know what she's going to say. She's really interesting. I can see her giving Keir Starmer a really tough time across the dispatch box if she got the job. But as we all know, she keeps saying things which would really go down very badly, I think, with the public the Tories have to win back, whether it's wanting to jail civil servants, you know, whether it's what she said about maternity pay, whether it's what she has said in her speech about suggesting at least that she wants to rip up the NHS settlement and start all over again. She keeps offering hostages to fortune, to the extent that one of my colleagues said that if Keir Starmer was genuinely declaring all his free gifts, he should put Kemi Badenoch at the top.
It's really interesting because the row over her comments on maternity pay broke on the first day of the conference and kind of set the tone of the conversations. Like, a lot of people were being asked about that. And then she made some comments on the minimum wage being too high. And actually, polls show that majority of Conservative voters think that the minimum wage is either at the right level or indeed too low. And I was actually in the conversation event where, having had all these controversies, she then made this throwaway conversation about how 5 to 10% of all civil servants should be in jail. And I watched her do it, and she had a little glint in her eye. She was answering a different question about whether civil servants should have set term limits. And she just went off on a bit of a tangent and then kind of said this thing with a bit of a grin and a wink. And very obvious that she didn't realise quite the implications of what she'd said.
Rachel, she never apologises for anything ever, does she?
No.
And I think there is an interesting temperamental question here. She is really impressive. She's a genuinely very, very impressive political performer. But does she have the temperament, or is she too brittle to actually be a party leader and suffer the constant observation and heckling of the press? She really doesn't like us, does she?
She really doesn't like us, and actually she did far fewer media interactions than anyone else. George, who impressed you or did not impress you over those days?
I agree with most observers that James Cleverly is the most polished, he's the most accomplished with the media. He'd probably stand the best chance at getting the Conservatives a hearing again from the public. But for me, there's one big weakness which stands out. Now, this is a Conservative leadership election, so they are by definition pitching to an unrepresentative group of the party members. But it's just amazing how little we've heard about public services, given that's one of the big reasons that the Conservatives suffered such a big landslide defeat. They are all in different ways still stuck in this Thatcherite universe where tax cuts, deregulation, privatisation are the solution to all of Britain's economic and social ills. Of course, the public exists in a very different world of record NHS waiting lists, crumbling schools, potholes. Now, the big question is there a candidate who could pivot, who could appeal to the Conservative base and then speak to the country, almost in the way you may say that Keir Starmer did when in the 2020 Labour leadership contest he offered what some characterised as Corbynism in a suit, and then obviously ruthlessly pivoted away from parts of that. My sense at the moment is that there's no one who's really prepared to move into the space. I mean, who's really prepared to make a sort of thorough repudiation of Trussonomics. I mean, one of the striking guests on the Fringe was Michael Gove, who obviously very prominent at the moment, and he said, during the mini budget, it looked as if we were experimenting on the country, and that we were free from the consequences, and we were just waiting to see how the patient responds. I think until the Conservatives really detoxify their brand, it doesn't matter how unpopular Labour or Keir Starmer are, Labour would be able to run a sort of better the devil you know election in the worst case scenario. And if the Conservatives haven't rebuilt trust, then the public won't go for them.
There are kind of two directions they could go in. Right, there's the trying to take on reform directly, which is very much Robert Jenrick's pitch and sort of Kemi Badenoch's. And then there is is there a space in the centre ground? What do you do about the Lib Dems kind of attitude? And
that is the existential choice they now must make. Which way do they go? You're absolutely right. I would say, again, perhaps unwisely doubling down, that James Cleverly is the one who is likeliest to turn back to where the public are on public services. He made a lot of the NHS in his speech. His mother, it turns out, works for the NHS. I think in politics, everybody's mother has worked for the NHS at some point. And I asked him about that Kemi Badenoch suggestion that she wanted to look again at the NHS, and he was unequivocal. He said, the solemn commitment we have made for generations to the British people is free at the point of use, and that is something we cannot change. And also, on your reform point, which is very well made there, the biggest applause he got in his speech when he said, absolutely no deals, no compromises with reform, we're not going there. And the Hall, interestingly, really liked that. So if they're going to, as it were, tilt away from that side of politics and think more about all those millions of voters who left for the Liberal Democrats and in some cases the Labour Party, I think he's still probably the man to do it.
We should talk about Robert Jenrick, who is still the front runner in the terms of MP endorsements, both in terms of MP votes and also the number of people who have publicly come out to back him. And it's kind of assumed that he will be in the final two. The other one is more up for debate. Not everyone was impressed with his speech. Jessie Norman, the Conservative grandee, said, I'm very sorry to have to say it, but that speech of Robert Jenrick's was lazy, mendacious, simplistic tripe. Tell us how you really feel, Jessie. He also, I was in a Q&A session with him where he revealed that he'd given his daughter the middle name Thatcher. Actually, what he was asked was, what middle name did you give your daughter? And he originally said Margaret Thatcher. So, compared to that, just Thatcher is almost more normal. But he's really, really playing this kind of Nigel Farage, but acceptable to the mainstream Tory party kind of vibe. Is that genuine? Is that effective?
It's a really good question. I've been around politics a lot and I've spoken to him a great deal. I don't really know who he is. I don't know whether this is a late conversion for career reasons or whether he has always been that sort of deep, as it were, Matthew Goodwin character inside himself. And I think that's the real question. How sincere is this? How deep is it? I don't know the answer.
His allies say he's been radicalised by experience.
By the Home Office, yeah.
Yes. Now, you do get these sort of political evolutions. I mean, part of the job of a good politician is to reflect the shifts within your party. So to that extent, he's a consummate politician. But I think you've got to be careful not to over-egg it. And there is a risk that it creates sort of unpleasant vibe. Even party activists recognise that you need a leader who can speak to the unconverted. And he, of course, got caught up in a controversy where he alleged that special forces were killing people rather than taking them hostage because of human rights law. I mean, Labour saw that as a massive gift to them because they could say, look, you're picking a fight with the armed forces. So they think, Kemi Badenoch's picked a fight with mothers, Jenrick's picked a fight with the armed forces, and the Conservatives sort of wonder why they lost the last election.
I find that comment really interesting because I got the sense that both James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat were making a fair amount of their military experience. Tom Tugendhat has basically made that the centrepiece of his campaign. Kemi Badenoch has obviously been very provocative, and I wonder if there was a moment where Jenrick was like, I need to kind of match these macho military boys or be as provocative as Kemi. And so he came out with this comment in a video about special forces that was based on an interview with the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who doesn't quite say what Jenrick suggested he said. And I did hear a lot of pushback from members, actually, who were a bit, he shouldn't have said that about our special forces.
And apparently also some blogs by Dominic Cummings, I'm told, as well. So, you make of that what you will. But, that was a mistake. There was a moment during the 1992 election when Chris Patten was being incredibly aggressive, too aggressive towards Labour. And he said, well, he was the Liberal thug. And if you are not a natural thug, it's really hard to know how hard to punch. And I get that sense a bit from Jenrick. This is relatively new to him. He's testing out these things. He's looking around in a world which includes people like Trump and Truss and all the rest of it, trying to work out how hard do I punch? And I think quite often he's getting it wrong at the moment.
And how do we think that Reform and the Lib Dems are feeling having watched that conference? How's Labour feeling having watched that conference? Which of the candidates are really a threat to the other parties?
I think Labour are pretty pleased with how Tory conference went from their perspective. I mean, what do ordinary voters notice? They would have perhaps seen Kemi Badenoch's comments on maternity pay. They may have seen Liz Truss appearing unrepentant.
The queue for
fringe.
that started an hour and a half before the event.
I mean, really, if you're the Conservatives, you would not have wanted her anywhere near that conference. I think the next leader is going to have to put some very sort of clear water between themselves and Liz Truss. I think if you're the Liberal Democrats, I think you'd be intensely relaxed because the one thing that conference did not do was give off the moderates feel. They had, not that much to say on the NHS, sewage, Europe. These are all core Lib Dem issues. If you're Reform, I think your view is probably they're trying to move into our space, particularly Robert Jenrick. But the bet that Reform can make is if voters are faced with choice, go for the real thing. Don't go for the Tribute Act.